After the first epistolary meeting with Rosanna Zarilli, she and I remained in contact, and I believe it was my colleague who gave me the address of the Arethusa bookshop. Undoubtedly, Turin, from the point of view of the astrological institutions, as well as for the number of scholars who studied the subject, and for its geographical and cultural proximity to France, which I personally consider the world capital of astrology in the last 3-4 centuries, was, in my opinion, the Italian capital of astrology for a good part of the 20th century. And within this framework, I believe that the driving and aggregating role that Carla Casalegno Rolli, and later also her son Andrea Rolli, had and still has, was absolutely primary. The Arethusa bookshop in Via Po 2 had in its stock ephemerides, tables of houses and texts of primary importance, both French and Anglo-American. For a neophyte hungry for astrology it was, and in many ways still is, like a renowned pastry shop in the eyes of someone who had fasted for a long period of time. Its push action in the Italian astrological movement that was forming right at the turn of the late 60s and the beginning of the 70s was itinerant in the sense that it moved physically to attend the events that were starting to take place a bit everywhere around Italy. And then, if you think about what it means to move hundreds and hundreds of books from one city to another, prepare tables, stand all day giving bibliographical advice, the specific expertise of the Casalegno Rolli family has played a primary role in the growth of our beloved discipline in our country. Eat almost never or very little, put everything back in the car late at night and leave for Turin. Well, without wanting to sanctify anyone, I personally believe that Carla Casalegno Rolli first, and then she again accompanied by her son Andrea, have the right to an important plaque in this short story that I am writing. It was Carla, still my very good friend today, who directed me to the man I consider to be the father of modern Italian astrology, Federico Capone. Of course, someone will say, others came before him and also wrote important texts. Just think of Nicola Sementovsky Curillo and Tommaso Palamidesi. But no one before Federico had spent even a small part of their life in a very long and patient and practically unremunerative work of sewing together the various fragments of what would become the Italian astrological fabric with its own precise cultural identity, without vassalage relationships with cousin astrologies, French, English, German, Swiss, Belgian, etc. With Federico, a kind of magical relationship was always established, probably due to our two signs of destiny. I am Cancer, solar sign, and he is Capricorn, both from the same land of origin, and moreover with small but important significant coincidences that strengthened and sealed our bond. Just think that Federico Capone's mother, almost a centenarian, lived a stone's throw from my house for many years, and Federico came here every year during the Easter holidays. Thus, after a first and very long series of letters, we met in person in Naples during one of his trips to his native land. I accompanied him on his rounds at the Neapolitan bookstores that took his first publications on deposit. Unfortunately, in most cases, he never received money back, both because there was no market at the time, and because he immediately turned towards a cultured, erudite, and also difficult astrology, disdaining a possible easy, popular, and profitable approach to the art of Urania. We must never forget that Federico Capone allowed many unknown names to publish their first work. Paradoxically, I did not publish my first text with him, but with Giovanni Armenia in 1977 and then in 1979, together with 2 other texts I published with him, my Prontuario di Calcoli. Federico never earned anything with astrology, and his patronage is also demonstrated by testimonies like mine, given that for many years, as I wrote earlier, I witnessed his wandering in vain, from an economic point of view, to the few historic Neapolitan bookshops specializing in esoteric astrological matters, never at the level of the Arethusa bookshop. The Colonnese bookshop in Via San Pietro a Maiella, 33, near the Music Conservatory, Luciano Guida's bookshop in Piazza dei Martiri, and the other of his cousin Geppino, first in Portalba, and then in Vomero in Via Merliani, the Ziccardi bookshop, today unfortunately it no longer exists, and the Marotta bookshop in Via dei Mille. I don't know which of us was, in some ways, crazier. As I wrote, I published with him a handbook of calculations by interpolation, a technical tool that greatly facilitated calculations, especially in the field of solar returns, and was a very valid alternative to the tables of logarithms. I set up the mathematical and graphic program and asked for help from a computer engineer with whom I had worked at the National Research Council in Naples. At that time, personal computers were not even a topic of discussion, and to obtain sheets of paper larger than A4 format, I had to go to the Neapolitan headquarters of IBM on Corso Vittorio Emanuele. There I was forced to sign a very onerous contract. It was about 600,000 or 700,000 lire per hour of use of the central unit of the computer. The thing worked like this. I brought punched cards with the instructions of the software to be launched and returned after a few days to collect the work. The work was processed in time sharing by the IBM computer in Milan, and up to this point nothing strange or worrying. The problem consisted in the fact instead, as I would understand only much later, that if my program had been wrong and had entered a loop, endless loop, it would have continued for hours before someone had stopped it and warned me that I had to ask my parents to sell their house to pay for the work. But Federico, from this point of view, was no less crazy than me, and went so far as to publish the Ephemerides from 1582 to 1699. He sold about 10 copies in total. But what copies! One was requested by André Barbol, one by Reinhold Ebertin, one by Henri J. Gouchon, another by Robert Hand. In short, as you will have understood, Federico and I deeply loved astrology and never thought of getting rich with it. Federico very generously was the Pygmalion of many good colleagues who today boast several works to their credit. I also went to visit him in his house in Alta Villa Irpina, where there is still a Via Capone and a Villa Capone in very bad condition, but still a witness to an important story in the path of Italy. Federico's grandfather was one of the first Italian parliamentarians, a socialist. I still remember the large portrait hanging on a slightly worn wall of the large house in the Avellino area. We disagreed a little on one point, but I, aware of my limits, my age, and the respect that was due to a master, never did anything to impose my ideas. Federico Capone did not care at all about the aesthetic aspect of his publications, and many times proceeding with collages of photocopies, clippings from books or newspapers and so on, he managed to assemble artisanal publications with his own hands. I, on the other hand, was for impeccable graphics, and suffered a little for that. We often went to eat something at a restaurant near my house, Palomella, still run by my old friend Mario and his 2 children, not yet born at the time. Federico liked good wine, and I was quite amazed by the quantities he managed to ingest of the god's favorite drink, without, however, ever losing his lucidity, even when we talked about mathematical calculations or astronomy. I have always had great affection and considerable esteem for my friend and teacher Federico, and I believe they were reciprocated. This is witnessed, perhaps, by the fact that I believe I was his second author, in terms of number of books published after Fulvio Moco. Even when I got married, October 3rd, 1973, during my honeymoon in Paris and Barcelona, I stopped in Turin to visit my friend Capone in his house in Via Morazzone 16. I remember a considerable mess of books, writings, envelopes to be sent or opened, but everything was under control. In the years immediately following our first meeting, on the occasion of his visits to Naples, I invited a group of enthusiasts from Campania, with whom I had by now formed an agape whose glue, needless to say, was astrology. At that time at our meetings at my house, the participants, not in alphabetical order, were Clara Negri, the late notary Arnaldo Appa, Anna-Marie Nic Iacono, a Parisian transplanted to Sorrento, Pantaleo Capelluti, Franco Futia, Ermanno Ricciardi, and later also Gustavo Miele and others. I apologize if I don't mention them all. I remember as if it were yesterday the first meeting between Federico Capone and Clara Negri. My friend from Turin Campania looked at her and commented, "I see something of Capricorn." "No, I'm an Aries," Clara replied. And I allowed myself, "But Clara, after all, Federico discovered your moon in Capricorn." One day in Naples, Federico was invited to dinner by a very important person, and he wanted to take me with him. We were in a wonderful villa in Posillipo with a private access to the sea. Our guest, who was a well-known public figure and would become even more so, wanted to have her birth Our guest, who was a well-known public figure and would become even more so, wanted to have her birth chart read by Federico. I followed with my usual greed. Suddenly I couldn't stop myself and told the lady that her sentimental situation would almost certainly change completely in the next 2 years. Good old Federico scolded me, rightly, and reassured the lady, but things later went exactly as I had predicted. Federico was very emotional when he gave a consultation, and, out of shyness, he wore a pair of dark glasses. In him, however, there was never any malice or bad faith or unpreparedness, just that bit of complexes that make many Capricorns lower their eyes even when they have no reason to do so. The web woven by Federico was vast because he never lost a single astrological contact he had during his entire life. That is how he spoke to me with enthusiasm about founding the Italian Center of Astrology that actually saw the light in Turin. On that occasion I was not physically present, with a group of astrology activists in March 1971. See documents that follow. I had membership card number 10 that I still have. With us were Professor Mario Viterbi, another very special figure of modern astrology in Italy, Professor Sergio Ghivarello, a brilliant mind and incomprehensible to the majority of us, Roberto Burro, who was immediately at the top of the organization, Giovanni Ressia, Vincenzo Vigna, Regulus was his stage name, Salvatore Turtula, Mr. Lavagna, Riccardo Arnaud, Michele Aquilano from Santeramo, and others, none of those who are known today by neophytes of the subject. I would like to remember Mario A. Viterbi, who was the true precursor of computer science applied to astrology in Italy. In fact, he implemented the first astrological calculation program on a mainframe He lived in a wheelchair, but his brain was like a Formula One. He was also very interested in homeopathic medicine and wrote a unique book on the combination of stars and homeopathic remedies. When I began to suffer for 24 years in a row from a strong headache, he took on an affectionate role towards me. He continually sent me homeopathic remedies so that I could try them. He also continually called me to get news, unfortunately always negative. When the monthly magazine Astra was inaugurated, he wrote the medical astrology column, but he died a few months later, and the director Giovanni Botteri asked me to take his place. I refused because I didn't understand medical astrology and proposed writing a column of astrological portraits of famous people, a column that was accepted. We'll come back to this because Giovanni Botteri and Astra, like Serena Foglia, also played a decidedly primary role in the birth of an Italian astrology. I remember that at the first International Congress of Astrology in 1975 and in Milan, Mario A. Viterbi introduced me with some beautiful words to the public. A young man who thinks with his own head and never says banal things or copied from others. On that occasion, Federico suggested that I go and shake Mario A. Viterbi's hand, but there would have been no need. His memory is still alive in me, and so is my gratitude. With Givarello, I always had a polite correspondence that never transformed into a true feeling of friendship. He, too, like Professor Viterbi, was very ill. We could say seriously ill since always. And he, too, was a true genius, but he was wrong, in my opinion, of not being able to make himself understood. And personally, I have always declared it publicly. When I wrote the review of one of his new books, I praised him a lot. But I also confessed that I had understood only 10% of what he wrote. Others rebelled and pretended to understand, but I am ready to confront anyone who wants to prove to me that they meant what they read about the Givarello myth. Probably one of the very few who understood it, and who was also able to stand up to him in the most difficult discussions, was Michele Aquilano, a teacher from Santeramo, Bari, still a dear friend of mine today, and nobody knows him for the simple reason that he is a shy person, incapable of appearing and directed above all to being. Federico Capone, after he created the CIDA, Italian Center of Astrology, and its official organ, Linguaggio Astrale, voluntarily stepped aside with great modesty when Serena Foglia approached Italian astrology, a woman and a researcher to whom we owe a great deal because she succeeded in years in which not even psychoanalysis had managed to do so, in ferrying the art of Urania into the world of official culture. It was her personal success of exceptional importance, of which perhaps even today only very few people have understood the true value. In the next episode of my brief history of contemporary Italian astrology, I will talk to you more extensively about her, about the turning point she was able to give to our beloved discipline, and about the continuation of this story. I would like to point out once again that this brief history of astrology in Italy from 1970 to today, for obvious technical reasons, cannot be told in parallel, but must necessarily follow a serial path. For this reason, you should not be surprised if I will write about some very important figures of the same only between different episodes. One case is worth all. Luciana Marinangeli, our highly esteemed colleague who played such a large part in the rebirth of contemporary Italian astrology, ideally representing that narrow agape of colleagues, including the writer, formed between the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, first through a path of Jungian analysis and then through the study and practice of astrology, will certainly be the object of great historical interest on our part, but more on that later. Instead, let's go back to the story where we left it. From Federico Capone and the Casalegno Rolli family, who, with their historic Arethusa bookshop, opened one of the first major passages to the Northwest for our discipline in our country in the modern era. Immediately after them, we find three equally important figures: Serena Foglia, Giuseppe Botteri, and Giovanni Armenia. Serena Foglia has given so much to our beloved discipline and has done more for it than many of us. She was born a woman of great culture. Her library in the magnificent Milanese residence on Via Aurelio Saffi is truly impressive, with multiple degrees, especially abroad, in both psychology and sociology. She knows really many languages perfectly, has a solid classical culture, and is famous in the early 70s for being the creator of the Inedito Literary Prize, which, as the title suggests, awards an unpublished writer every year. When Serena Foglia decided to deal with astrology, she did it in grand style, bringing with her all her class, but also a specific know-how in the field of communication that was of considerable weight in the operation that I defined from the beginning of clearing astrology in Italy in years in which people of culture even denied being in analysis for fear of being ridiculed. So Serena Foglia picked up the baton that the great Federico Capone generously offered her and led SIDA towards something important in those years of her presidency. She organized in Milan on September 27th and 28th, 1975, a first international conference of astrological studies, which was held in the prestigious building of the Museum of Science and Technology, and which saw the participation of a very large audience. Many remained standing for the entire duration of the proceedings, as well as highly accredited journalists from the printed press, radio, and television. Those who were not among the participants of that event will struggle to understand the true breadth of the phenomenon. The magic of those 2 days recounted on the front page and in 4 columns of the main Italian newspapers, and the huge success with the public and critics, made more than one person think that all this happened simply because Serena Foglia was kissed in those days by extraordinary and positive planetary transits. In fact, in addition to those which were obligatory, there was a long, laborious, wise, and intelligent work based above all on the methodologies of communication science, a science that ours already mastered extensively, having lived for long periods of time also in the United States of America. The choice of the venue for the conference should already make us think, because in times in which, I repeat, even a progressive politician would have been careful not to declare in public that he was undergoing analysis, Foglia chose not the archaeological museum, where perhaps she would have obtained with little difficulty permission to hold such a kermesse, but none other than the Museum of Science and Technology,